So give yourself plenty time and do it early enough. Okay, I did not give you a practice quiz this time, but I'm counting on you having not changed your computer settings. So if it worked last time, it should work this just fine this time. And then going forward, like I said, initially I made everything due on Wednesday because that's when we are supposed to have classes. Um, so we have to switch gears now to start a unit on Wednesday and end it on Monday. But then it dawned on me, I explained this last time, the other day, I was like, well, we're not really having class on Wednesday, so I don't have to make it due on Wednesday. So going forward, your concept check quiz for the new units will be due on Friday at class time. So you have 2 more days to get rid of it, no, not get rid of it, to get ready for it. So that way you don't have to feel like, finishing something on Monday and then getting ready by Wednesday, a new unit. So hopefully this way the workload is more evened out. So for example, by this Friday, please watch the video and finish your concept check quiz for Unit 8. And then by next Monday, we'll meet together in class and finish talking about it. And then we'll move on to Unit 9. Okay, so we're only just about 3.5 weeks away from being done with the whole semester. Usually by now, this is when people, get a little stressed out and a little burnt out. So hang in there. We're almost there. And I'm hoping that with only meeting once a week and having the flexibility to watch the video on your own, you're not as burned out as normal. Even though I know, being online all the time is tough. Okay. Um, okay. So today we don't have the top hat code just because the test is technically open, and that means you could have taken it already. So I'm not requiring a code today. Okay, but all right. Well, this review is based on your questions, and the only requirement I have is let's go 1 unit at a time, so we don't jump back and forth, back and forth. So to find the review guide, go to our Canvas course, click on the module called Test Materials, and then it's the Test 2 topic guide there. Okay, and so go ahead and take a look at Unit 4, which is on Chapters 7 and 8, okay, about unemployment, inflation, and then productivity, okay. Tell me if you have any questions, then let's talk about it. And then if you have questions in future units, let's hold off until, yeah, we're ready for it. By the way, I really hope this is not the first one. I mean, first time you're looking at all these, okay? Then if that's the case, it might be too late. You're supposed to be, have been studying all along, and this is your chance to ask questions from your studies, okay?
Could we just briefly go over the 4 types of unemployment again?
Okay, yeah. So the 4 types of unemployment. Okay, we said the first kind is called frictional unemployment. Okay, frictional means it is the time that people take to find a better fit uh, in their employment. So whether it's workers trying to find the best positions, or employers taking time to find the better fit for their positions, right? So during that time, people are unemployed, and we said this is the good kind of unemployment because it is healthy and it helps people become more productive and etc. So that is something we welcome. Okay, that's frictional unemployment. Okay, structural unemployment is when we say somehow the system, the setup of the system just makes it makes you unemployed, right? So we talked about examples of um, if you have your skills are no longer in demand, right? And you're a steel worker and we just don't produce steel anymore. You can be unemployed. That's structural. Or you have a mismatch of geographical location of your skills and where they're needed, right? So we talked about how you might be an amazing actor, and if you just walk on any set of a production, you can just blow everybody away and win an Oscar very easily. But you live in Salmon, Idaho, then chances are you're not going to find a good job doing what you want to do, right? Or we talked about how unions really protect jobs of its members, but it creates unemployment by blocking outsiders from getting jobs and setting up um, their um, their wages too high, right? So those are all examples of structural unemployment. Okay, then the next one is cyclical unemployment. We say cyclical unemployment is unemployment caused by a recession. Okay, which is what we are seeing now. Right, our current unemployment is in the double digits, so 16.9%, and much of it, right, at least 10% of that is caused by the recession. So we say that's the worst type of unemployment that we don't want to have, right? Because that's when people lose their jobs, not because their skills are no longer in demand, just because nobody's buying the products anymore and they have to be laid off, right? Then finally, your book talks about a fourth type that's not as common compared to other textbooks, which is seasonal unemployment, right? That's when you have Santa Clauses, not finding jobs in July, right? So um, but those are the different types of unemployment. Okay. And then related to that, we said full unemployment is what? How do we define full? I mean, sorry, not full unemployment. Full employment. How do we define that again?
When there's zero cyclical unemployment,
Okay.
right?
Yep. Yeah. When there's zero cyclical unemployment, we say we're at full employment. And full employment thus means you're not having zero unemployment. You still have frictional and structural. That's totally okay. Okay, and even seasonal, according to this book. So, um, so that's why our natural rate of unemployment, which happens when we are at full employment, is around 4 to 5% in the United States, right? But then again, I talked about in the lecture, do not ever use the number to define full unemployment, right? Just because we're at 5% doesn't mean we are at full employment. You have to look at cyclical, okay? The only definition for full employment is when cyclical is zero, okay? Okay? All right, any other questions?
I have one question.
Yep.
Can we go over how to calculate the labor force participation rate, the unemployment rate, and the natural rate?
Well, the natural rate is just what we just talked about, right? It is when your cyclical unemployment is zero. Okay. Let me share the screen on my device here. So, okay. All right. So the labor force participation rate, okay. Okay, what does this one equal to again? I'll give you a hint. It's something divided by something times 100.
It's the number of adults in the workforce divided by the total number of adults who want to be in the workforce, whether or not they are.
Okay,
Or
so
no, it's adults who. No. I think that was it. Yeah,
think
it's
okay.
adults in the labor force divided by total adults in the population who could qualify for the workforce.
Okay, so we just call that labor force, right? Not just adults in the labor force, it's just called labor force divided by the adult population. That's what we call it. Okay, but you're right, Josh. Okay, so um, now, first of all, let's look at this. Okay, who's in the labor force? How do we calculate the labor force?
Isn't everyone looking for a job regardless if they have one or don't have one? Everyone who has and is looking for a job.
Okay, yeah, so it's everyone who has a job plus everyone who's looking for a job. Okay, but like Josh said, these have to be um, adults. So for the adult population, okay, the full name is the civilian non-institutional adult population. So who are these people?
People who are over 18, not in the military, and not, for lack of a better, not institutionalized.
Okay, so
I was going to say crazy, but that's not the right word.
well, I mean, it's not just mental hospitals, but also yeah, prisons, right? But is 18 the cutoff age?
I think it's 16, isn't it?
It's 16. Okay, so adult population is all those who are older than 16 who are not in the military and not institutionalized, such as being in prison or in a mental hospital. Okay, so all those people add up to the adult population. The adult population is everybody that's theoretically eligible, to work, right? And then labor force includes all the people who have jobs and who are looking for work, because there are other people in the adult population that just don't work, right? So, for example, retired people, right? Like I mentioned before, unfortunately, being an adult is a irreversible condition, right? Once you get it, you die with it. So, um, yeah, you can't shrink back to be a kid again. Okay, but you can graduate out of the labor force, fortunately. So. All right, so that's the labor force participation rate. So you got to remember how to calculate the labor force and who to include in the adult population, and then just do the ratio between the two times 100. Okay, so the unemployment rate. Okay, how do we calculate this one? Again, it's something divided by something times 100. So what goes on top, what goes on the bottom?
Well, the top would be unemployed persons, right?
Right, so the top is people who are unemployed divided by what?
Is it over the labor force?
It is over the labor force. Very good. Okay. So again, labor force equals unemployed plus employed, so you can write it that way as well. Okay. But that's how you calculate the unemployment rate. You take the number of people who are unemployed, means who want to work but can't find any, so they're looking, divided by the labor force, which is the number of people who are looking plus people who are working. Okay, so that's your unemployment rate. Okay, very good. All right, any questions? Does that make sense? Did that help, Gonzalo? Okay, any other formulas you wanted to look at?
We talk about calculating growth rate because it says it on there, and we're talking about
Yeah,
growth rate.
yeah, we said growth rate is something you calculate under many different kind of contexts in this class, right? So the generic formula for growth rate is always, okay, the new value of whatever you're looking at minus the old value, okay, divided by the old value times 100, right? So you can apply this to many different contexts. So for example, the growth rate of your CPI is what we call inflation rate, right? We'll talk about that in a minute. And then you can have the growth rate in your GDP and a bunch of other scenarios. So just remember, this is the generic form of any growth rate, okay? Okay, so Josh said it seems like there's a lot of different kinds of inflation. It makes me confused. Okay, there's no different kinds of inflation. There are different things that are similar to inflation, but inflation is the only thing, you know, is its own thing. Okay, you might be thinking about inflation, which is the increase in the price level. we also have deflation, which is the decrease in the price level. And then we have disinflation, which is what again? Does anybody remember what disinflation is?
Isn't it inflation at a reduced rate?
Right. So disinflation is when you have inflation still, but inflation is getting milder and milder. So, 3 years ago it was 10% inflation, 2 years ago it was 8%, 1 year ago it's 5%, this year it's going to be 3%. So every year you still have inflation and price level is still increasing, but it's increasing less and less. We call that disinflation. Okay. And then another thing that's talked about here is hyperinflation. And we said that's when you have hundreds or thousands or higher inflation, percent of inflation every year. And that doesn't happen very often, fortunately. Okay. Is that what you're asking, Josh?
Kind of. I guess it was more like, I feel like there's lots of different ways of doing it. It's like there was the CPI, which to me kind of seemed like inflation, and there was also, I don't know. It kind of, that was just one thing that kind of stood out to me, but now it does make a little more sense.
Okay, so inflation is the percentage change in your CPI. CPI measures that's your price index, which is also what we call price level, which is an average price for everything overall. Okay, but by itself, it's not inflation. It's only when your CPI increases from 1 year to another, then we have inflation, right? So CPI is measuring prices. Inflation is measuring the growth in your prices. Okay, so different things. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, now by the way, so because here inflation is a big chunk of this, okay, I do still expect you to be able to calculate your CPI and then your inflation rate, which is something that we initially talked about, for I can't remember, I think it's chapter 5 or something. So even though it's not introduced again here, but it is still a topic on this test. So make sure you remember how to calculate CPI and inflation rate and all that. Okay. All right. Any other questions from Unit 4?
What are the differences between, I just read it, anticipated versus unanticipated inflation?
Okay, so anticipated, you can plan for it, right? You can, so the impact on the economy is not as bad. And unanticipated is when people get caught off guard, and then that means the plan to produce for producers and your plan for having a certain level of standard of living can be totally wrong, and that's a lot more harmful for the economy. Right? So that's the bottom line, I guess. Okay. Now, yeah. So anyway, so any other questions? Okay, if not, I want to point out a couple of things just to make sure you guys have thought of it, right? So first of all, you got to be able to know how to tell the different types of unemployment if when I give you a scenario, right? So we talked about the definitions, but then if I give you a specific scenario, you got to be able to fit it in the right category, okay? And then the different types of calculations, we already talked about it. Then when it comes to inflation, okay, a related thing we haven't talked about is how inflation and interest rates are related, right? So that's the example we talked about in class where you're borrowing money from your cousin to start your taco truck. Right? This is where the taco truck got started, and you agree to pay your cousin back a certain percentage, and then inflation is this much. And then we talked about if your cousin actually came out on top with this deal or not. Okay. Then productivity, and you got to understand what it is, and then the part that usually people struggle with is the per worker productivity function, right? So those are the things that usually I see to be challenging for people, okay? Now, any questions on those I just mentioned or anything else in Unit 4?
Yeah, the last one you just mentioned there about the function. What was that one?
The per worker productivity function.
Can we go over that?
Okay. All right. So what is productivity? What does productivity measure?
Isn't it like the output?
It definitely has something to do with the output, but specifically
It,
what? Yeah, Josh?
it is how much output is produced per unit of something.
Per unit of what? You're right.
Of labor.
Capital?
Okay. Yeah, and it doesn't have to be capital, but per unit of some kind of an input. Okay.
Right.
So yeah. So productivity looks at how much, how many products one unit of input can make for you. It can be capital, it can be labor. So here we said, your output, okay, on the national level is real GDP. We denote that with a Y, right? And then the most basic economic models still assume you need to have two kinds of inputs to produce. You need to have capital and you need to have labor, right? You can't produce anything without both. Okay. Now, the problem with looking at this is there are three things going on. So if we were to study how your output is impacted by your inputs, you're going to have a three-dimensional graph and an equation with three variables. That's going to be very complicated. So we were trying to figure out, well, how can we reduce this to a two-dimensional graph that you can easily look at and understand? And that's when we came up with this per worker idea, right? We said, well, instead of looking at the total for the economy, let's look at per worker, right? By doing per worker, you just divide all these three by the amount of labor. L is labor, K is capital, okay? Then you call the per worker productivity little y, okay? That's how much each worker produces for you. And then your capital divided by the amount of workers is little k. That's your per worker capital, okay? And then L divided L becomes 1. It's a number, so it's no longer a variable. All of a sudden, the only two things that vary are right here, little k and little y. So it is now a relationship between just two variables, so you can put it on a two-dimensional graph, right? So then you say, okay, then this tells me how much each worker can make for me given different amount, where did it go? Given different amount of capital I give this worker, okay? And to draw this out, we said this is a function that looks something like this, okay? It's a positive function, meaning that if you give each worker more capital, they will produce more for you, right? We said if you give your let's say you hire your roommate to make tacos for you, you give them one griddle, okay? Awesome. And then let's say they produce, okay, 20 tacos for you. Then if you give them two griddles, whoops, not 20, two griddles, okay, and maybe they'll produce, okay, 30 tacos for you. Then if you give them three, like, one person with three griddles, okay, maybe they'll make, 35 tacos for you. So every time you give more capital to this one worker, they can make more products for you, but, okay, each additional unit of capital, each new griddle helps less and less, right? The first griddle helps with 20, the second griddle only adds 10, the third griddle only adds 5. So that's why this graph is increasing but flattening out. It's increasing at a decreasing rate, okay? So we said that's because, if you just keep throwing capital to the same worker, they cannot manage the capital as efficiently forever, right? They cannot just devote as much time to operating griddle evenly. So as a result, it helps, but it helps less and less. Okay, and now, so the key thing here is what affects your per worker productivity function and what moves along. When I say affect, I mean by shifting or rotating, right? So one thing that people keep forgetting, even though I just showed this to you, is when you change the amount of capital per worker, okay, you're just moving along your existing curve, right? When you go from one griddle to two to three, you're just moving along because capital here per worker is already something you allow to vary. So your line, your function already includes all the possible levels of capital you can give people. And so that does not shift your curve. That's something that people forget a lot. Okay. Now, what can shift this curve? And what does it mean to shift this curve?
Improvement in technology or in capital?
Okay. Yeah. So Luke said improvement in technology. Okay. That is definitely one that can allow your curve to shift or rotate upward like this. Okay, so if you buy brand new griddles that are a lot more efficient in cooking, tacos or whatever you need to do, then that means even with one griddle, right, you still give your worker one griddle, but it's a new one, okay, then that means they can produce 28 tacos for you with just one, okay, and then you can see in this case with two griddles, they can make 36, okay? And with three griddles, looks like they can make, I don't know, let's say something like 42 or whatever. I'm just making the numbers up. The point is, okay, having new technology can increase your productivity. You can have the same amount of capital, but you can produce more with new technology. And similarly, we said education and training can do the same thing, right? We talked about how you decide to send your roommate to go hang out with your grandma, who's the taco guru, for a week, and then your roommate will come back knowing exactly how to make everything perfectly. And then even if you only give them one griddle, they can make more for you, or etc. So education, training, and technology are the things that can shift your per worker productivity function. Okay, but changing the capital itself only moves you along the curve. Okay. All right. Any other questions from Unit 4? Okay, you guys are really getting me a little concerned because feels like the lack of questions is because you haven't really put in as much effort into studying. Okay, and like I said, by now it probably is too late. You're cramming now, and that's the worst approach to a test. Okay. So I hope I'm wrong, but anyway. Okay, you ready to move? Yeah, go ahead, Josh.
I have a question about the price level, although it's not about this unit, it's about the last unit. So maybe later.
No, that's fine. I mean, which last unit? You mean unit 7?
Yeah,
Or
not the last, but the last from, Anyway, so when you have this graph with the price, is it always apply price level on the y-axis?
yeah.
Okay, I was just checking because I got kind of confused on one of the quizzes. So whenever it goes up, it always means that the price level increases.
Price level is always the y-axis, yes.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Okay. You guys ready to move on to Unit 5? Okay. All right. Unit 5 is on aggregate demand. So this is the one that we introduced a lot of the formulas like the MPC and the consumption function, and then the multiplier, spending multiplier. Okay. Well, I guess, never mind. I'm not sharing that screen. I was gonna say I can't fit it all on one screen. You can take a look yourself. See if you have any questions.
We talk about calculating government budget balance.
Okay. Yeah. Oops. Come on. So we said the budget balance, right, is the income for the government, which is net taxes, minus the spending of the government, which is um, government spending, right? So that's how you calculate the government budget balance right here, okay? And then for our government, the spending is usually way bigger than the net taxes they collect. So we have a negative budget balance. We call that a budget deficit. And then when, there are a few governments out there that actually continue to accumulate positive budget balances, we call that budget surpluses. Okay? And this is on an annual basis. When you add up all the previous year's budget balances together, we have our national debt, okay? And we looked at that last week, and we're over $26 trillion, right? Okay, did that answer your question, Isaac? Okay, great. Anything else from Unit 5?
Could we go over the two parts about investment, investment in economics, the three types of investment, and the investment demand curve?
Okay, yeah. So we said there are only three things considered as investment in econ. Okay, what are they again? Does anybody remember?
Purchase of a home.
Okay, so not a purchase of a home.
The
You're
building of a
close.
home.
Huh?
Wait, can you repeat your question?
What are the three things we consider as investment in economics?
And buy an
Equipment,
inventory.
new buildings, and then increase in net in inventory.
Okay, very good. Right? Yeah, so very good. Okay, so first thing is, okay, purchase of physical capital. Okay, so that is when you buy equipment, machinery, and computers, whatever, right? So the second is new buildings. Okay, so this is, I think, what Josh, you were thinking about. It's not a purchase of a home, but it has to be a new structure. Okay, if you buy a home that was already built previously, that's not part of investment. Okay, it has to be brand new construction. Okay, but it's not just homes. Any kind of brand new construction is investment. Okay, and then inventories. So any increase in inventories. So these are the three things we call investment in economics. The biggest one is the first one, physical capital. Okay, and now in this chapter, we said aggregate demand is measuring the total spending in the economy. Okay, and we said total spending are those four things that go into your real GDP equation, right? Consumption is your spending from households. Investment is spending from firms. Then government spending, and then net exports is spending in our economy from the rest of the world. So and when it comes to investment, we looked at, in this chapter, we pretty much just looked at these four individually. So when we looked at investment, we said, okay, to keep your life simple, we assume investment is autonomous. Okay, so again, what does autonomous mean again? We
It's
talked
not
about that.
affected by GDP.
Okay, it's independent of income, and in this case, national income is real GDP. Okay, very good. So autonomous means independent of something, and we said in macroeconomics, it's always independent of income or real GDP, right? So that means, if you look at your investment function, it's autonomous, okay, meaning once firms choose how much to invest in, let's say I1, which is $100 billion, okay, then doesn't matter what's going on in our economy, okay, the real GDP can be high, real GDP can be low, firms will just stick to their plan of investing $100 billion, okay, so this is what we mean by autonomous investment function, okay? Now, the next thing we said, well, if investment does not depend on real GDP, it does depend on something. Okay, what does it depend on? What's on the vertical axis here that we say is the thing that investment is impacted by?
Interest rate?
Okay, it's the interest rate, right? Little I is the interest rate. Okay, and we said investment demand looks like any regular demand curve you have where when the interest rate is high, right? So high interest rate gives you low investment. Then when the interest rate becomes low, okay, that's when investment becomes really high. And we said that is because, well, first of all, most investment projects are done with borrowed money. Whoops, sorry, not high low. This is high, okay? And most um, investment projects are done with borrowed money. So so the interest rate measures your cost for borrowing money, right? Because when the interest rate is high, then that means you have to pay a lot to borrow money, and that means it's less likely for your investment to generate a positive profit. So firms are less likely to invest. But when the interest rate is really low, then firms are more willing to borrow money and invest. And then we said, well, what if, okay, this firm is really frugal and they've been saving for decades and they have enough cash to buy new physical capital or build a new factory. If that's the case, do they still follow this negative investment demand curve, negatively sloped demand curve for investment? Okay, Isaac, you're nodding. Why? If you have cash, you don't need to borrow money. Why do you still follow this investment demand curve?
Because couldn't you make more like saving it and using the interest off that instead of building the plant?
Okay, yeah, so we said in class or in the lecture video that if you have cash, then your alternative with your cash from investing in your own production is to let others borrow your cash, right? So borrow your money. And in that case, the interest rate becomes the measure of what you can earn from letting others borrow your money, okay? So when you choose to invest your own cash, then the interest rate is measuring the opportunity cost of investing, right? Because if the interest rate is really high, that means when you choose to invest, you're letting go of a high interest you could have earned by letting others borrow your money. And so when the interest rate is high, firms with cash are still less likely to invest that cash themselves. They would rather just loan it out and earn interest that way, right? But when the interest rate is low, so that cash is not earning them much of anything anyway, then they're a lot more likely to invest using their own cash. So even when they have cash, they still follow the same investment demand curve. And so interest rate is the only thing here we assume to impact your investment decision, right? So whatever the interest rate is, okay, so let's say that um, this is, 10% interest, and this is the $100 billion of investment firms decided to do. So that's where the I1 comes from over here on the left hand side. Now let's say if the interest rate drops to 2%, and as a result, okay, firms decide to invest $400 billion, then over here on the left side with your investment and with your investment function, what you're going to see is that you're going to have a shift to $400 billion of investment, and it'll just shift up this way. Okay, and that's a shift caused by the lowering of your interest rate. Okay. All right. Any other questions from Unit 5? I just had a happy thought. Maybe you guys don't have too many questions. It's because you all studied really well and there are no questions. So that makes me happy. All right. Okay. Sorry. Who was asking? Oh, Josh, go ahead.
So one of the things I've had trouble with is kind of converting I don't know if this is going not far ahead, but I guess since this is where MPC is introduced, I've kind of had trouble having like the equations with y and then fitting those in with MPC. So could we do a few examples of those?
What do you mean with y fitting with MPC? Like, are you talking about when we solve for equilibrium?
Yeah, so like when we say something like y equals c plus I plus g, like we have equations like that, and then we have I don't know. I think that no, I think that is this unit, right?
That's where we introduce the all that stuff. Okay, so remember, you plug whatever information into whichever thing you're trying to solve, right? If you're trying to solve for y, you plug everything into the equation for y. Okay, the biggest mistake people make is that they plug the equation for y into something else. Then in that case, you're trying to solve for something else. Okay, so this we've done several times, right? So I've given you examples in class, and you've done it in your homework, and then later on we did it again in Unit 7. So let's do another quick example. So let's say you know C equals 200 plus 0.8 times, okay, disposable income, and I is 400, and G is, let's say, 800, and net taxes is 600, and then you have exports of 300 and imports of 500. And I'm just making numbers up here. Okay, now if you have things like that, and I ask you, what is your equilibrium GDP? Right? Is this the kind of question you're wondering about, Josh?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, all right. So now we said to get started, okay, you need to first of all remember, well, real GDP, which was what we're looking for, is C plus I plus G plus net exports, right? So that's the first step you need to know. And then, okay, you just need to plug everything into this equation because you're trying to solve for y, so you make sure you plug everything into this y equation. Okay, don't plug y into anything else. Okay, so if that's the case, then we say y becomes c, which is 200 plus 0.8 times yd. So disposable income. That's where you should know that disposable income is your real GDP minus net taxes, right? Because disposable income is after tax income. So it's your total income minus your taxes. So then you can plug that in. So whereas y minus net taxes, which is 600 right here, okay? So that's C, right? Everybody with me so far? Okay, and then you plus I, which is 400, you plus G, which is 800, and then net tax is not part of the real GDP equation, so don't add it in again. It's already included in the disposable income part, okay? And then you plus your net exports, which is exports minus imports, so 300 minus 500, okay? So that's then the equation you need to solve, right? Because it only is one equation with one unknown of y. There's just one thing that we need to figure out. That's it. Okay. So you put all the numbers together. You say y equals, so 200, okay, plus 400 is 600, plus 800 is 1400, and plus negative 200 is 1200. So you have 1200. Okay, and plus 0.8 times y minus 600. Okay, again, everybody with me so far? I just added up all the numbers. Okay, so here, again, the most common mistake people make is they add 1200 and 0.8 first and then multiply y minus 600. And that is a mathematical error because when you have an addition and a multiplication, you need to calculate your multiplication first, right? That's the order of operations. So you have y equals then 1200 plus 0.8 times y, then minus 0.8 times 600, right? Because when you multiply 0.8 into that parentheses, you need to make sure both pieces are multiplied by 0.8. Okay, so then this becomes y equals 1200 minus 0.8 times 600 is 480. So 1200 minus 480 is 720, right? So 720 plus 0.8y. Okay, again, everybody with me so far? Okay, now we want to move all the y's to one side of the equation and numbers on the other side so we can solve it. So we minus 0.8y on both sides of the equation. Okay, since you're subtracting the same thing on both sides, the equation still holds. And then on the right-hand side, 0.8y cancel each other out. So y minus 0.8y, we said y is really 1y. We just don't write the 1 in front of it. And so 1y minus 0.8y is 0.2y and equals 720. And you divide both sides by 0.2. Okay, that gives you what? 3600 or something like that. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's how you figure out the equilibrium. But the key again, so all this is just simple calculations. You just need to make sure you don't make any math error. But the key is right here where you need to know you start with the real GDP equation and you remember what disposable income equals to. Once you know these two, just plug everything into this y equation because y is what you're trying to solve. Okay, now there's no shortcut except some practice. So if you still feel rusty about this, you just gotta practice like this. Okay, make up some numbers and then solve for it. Okay, or review the questions you've already done because we've done several. Okay. All right. Any other questions from this unit? Okay. So the only thing I want to remind you is just, the equation that ties everything together here, right? We said, first of all, the multiplier is 1 over 1 minus MPC. That's the spending multiplier. Okay. And then I've told you about the three ways of finding the MPC, right? Then we said to tie it all together, what it means is the multiplier tells you how much your real GDP is going to change when there's some kind of initial spending change, whether it's a change in C or change in I or change in G or change in net exports, right? Either any of those will be multiplied by the 1 over 1 minus MPC to have their impact on real GDP. Right? So this is the equation that really ties everything together for this unit. Okay. All right.
Brother Mo,
Yeah.
what was the other multiplier, the tax multiplier formula?
That is not until unit 7, right? But
okay.
that one is negative MPC over 1 minus MPC. That's the tax multiplier. Okay. Okay.
About unit 6. There's one problem that I didn't understand in the quiz. Do you mind if I share my screen for a second?
Yeah. Let me make sure we're ready to move on to unit 6 first. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Any other questions from unit 5?
The one you have circled right there, what is that one called again?
That's just the formula to tell you how much real GDP gets changed with the multiplying effect. I don't have an eloquent name for it.
I have a
Okay?
question.
Yeah.
What do you mean by know the role of net exports play in the calculation of aggregate demand?
Oh, that's just, we talked about in class the how different things can affect your net exports, right? So your net exports is part of your real GDP and aggregate demand. Okay, so when things change, then that impacts the aggregate demand and then real GDP, right? So we talked about in class how if we have, higher inflation than foreign countries, how's that going to impact your net exports? And if we have, higher income changes than other countries, how's that going to impact your net exports? And several other factors that we discussed in the lecture video, and just different things that impact, your trade pattern. And then in turn, when your trade changes, your net export changes, and then that's going to affect your real GDP, right? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Good. Any other questions from Unit 5? Okay. All right. Then let's move on to Unit 6, which is aggregate supply. Okay. See, was it Josh? Did you say you had a question you want to share your screen for? Okay. All right. I've activated your ability to share, so go ahead and share your screen now. Okay, all right. See, let me see if I can pull it up. Okay, what's your question? You're still muted.
All right. Sorry. So why is this evidence that the price level was lower than expected? Because that was the correct answer.
Okay, so the figure below shows equilibrium, and the shift from AS to AS is likely to occur when, okay, let's see.
I guess my question is why would the price why would supply increase if the price level is lower than expected?
Okay, so when the price level, okay, yeah, scroll down a little bit. Let me see all the options and stuff. Okay.
1 second. I'm gonna.
Okay, there we go. That's better. Yeah. Okay, so let me look at this to make sure all the options are considered. The actual output has more than potential output. No. Okay. Aggregate demand curve. No. Okay. The actual price level is lower than expected. Okay. Yeah. So this goes back to what we talked about, where we said, your aggregate supply curve is your plan for production, right? And this is how much you think you'll produce at all the possible price levels, okay? Now, if the actual price level, which is determined by where aggregate demand curve crosses your aggregate supply, right? If the actual price level equals your expected price level, then you're going to produce at your potential GDP, because that's the normal production, right? If it is higher, if the price level is higher than you anticipated, then you are currently going to produce more than you planned, more than your potential GDP, because we said, you have already signed a contract and locked into your wages, so your cost for production is not going to be different, and higher price level just means the firm can get higher profit, right? Higher revenue, so they're going to produce more than they planned. And now, if the price level is lower than anticipated, like this case, okay, that means then the firms are getting less profit than they thought. So they're going to initially produce less than they planned, okay? Then this change here is what happens eventually in the long run, okay? So when they produce less than planned, that creates what we call a contractionary gap, right? Because our production is lower than the potential GDP, because they're not getting as much price level as they were hoping. So when they produce less, they have to lay off workers. They don't need as many workers. So with that gap of contractionary gap, then we have a recession, really. So eventually, in the long run, people are going to accept lower wages, and because the price level their wages were based on a higher price level than what it actually is. So people got more real income than they thought, and that caused some people to be laid off, and we fall into a recession. So eventually people are going to say, okay, fine, I'll take lower wages because yeah, I was earning too much. And once they accept lower wages, then that means your cost of production is decreasing, which means then your aggregate supply is going to shift to the right. Okay, and then we said, that will continue to happen until it shifts to where aggregate demand will cross long run aggregate supply. And so if you stop sharing, I can draw this process on the board. Okay. All right. So what we were talking about here, okay, it's easier to look at this with the long run perspective in there. Okay. So we said, the long run is where the normal is. Okay. And this is your short run, which is your plan. And so you expect the price level to be here, right? And so that because you are planning on producing your normal level of production at Y star, right? With me so far? Josh?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So now the actual price level is determined by aggregate demand. So aggregate demand, you were hoping or expecting it to cross right here, right? But in reality, let's say aggregate demand actually crossed right here. So now the actual price level is determined by this point. So this is the actual price level. So call it P of superscript A. Okay. But because the actual is lower than expected, then production is going to be lower than potential. Okay. So we have a contractionary gap, which is a recession, right? Then we said eventually, okay, people are going to take lower pay because we have a recession, and then as they take lower pay, then your short run aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the right because lower pay means lower cost of production. Okay, and then eventually you go to long run equilibrium and you go to Y star, like like where the economy always wants to go. Okay, that makes sense?
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. All right. Any other questions from Unit 6, which is aggregate supply? This one graph and one scenario that Josh asked really encompassed pretty much all the points we introduced here, right? But any other questions from that? You guys feel pretty good about it? Okay, all right, then let's move on to the last unit, which is something we just finished. Hopefully it's still fresh on your mind, right? Fiscal policy. Any questions there? All right, the biggest difference, of course, is, with policy, we said we will always shift aggregate demand to close any gap, right? So up to this point, when we didn't introduce policy, we said, a short run aggregate supply curve will shift when there's no interference with the economy. If we leave the economy alone, it is always the SRAS curve that will shift to close any gap, right? I asked you to write that down. And then, but then we also said, well, John Maynard Keynes, who was the one that kind of got policy intervention started, said in the long run, we're all dead, right? So we don't want to wait for the economy to close itself in the long run eventually. And so that's when he said the government needs to interfere and implement policy to shift aggregate demand to close gaps. Okay, so that's the biggest difference. But any questions from Unit 7?
Could we review the lags of fiscal policy?
Yeah, so we talked
The
about
limits?
yeah, so we talked about why fiscal policy in reality, it doesn't work as well as we draw on a graph, right? On a graph, we just say, well, if we implement a fiscal policy, that will shift your aggregate demand curve to the right or to the left and restoring the economy to the long-run equilibrium. That's easier said than done in reality because we said, first of all, you have a recognition lag, right? Because it takes time to realize we're in trouble. Okay, now it didn't take much time to realize the kind of trouble we're in currently, but that's because everybody saw the coronavirus coming and everybody saw that things getting shut down. But normally, when it's something else and then a pandemic, we don't really see that impact right away. So we have to gather data, look back, and realize, oh, wait a second, right? Our economy has not been doing well for a while. So there's a recognition lag, okay? And then we said there's a decision lag, okay? So once we realize, hey, we're in a recession, what are we going to do about it, right? And then we said, well, most of the time, if we want to do any kind of discretionary fiscal policy, it involves the Congress. And the Congress is really not known for their efficiency, right? They drag things on for months and sometimes years. So by the time we discuss what to do, come up with a plan, and roll all the political favors into it, and have both parties agree, it probably is several months. Well, several months probably will have passed already at that point. And then we have implementation. Okay, so once we come up with a plan, like this last measure we did of sending everybody some tax cut money was passed in record time, just a few weeks. It was passed, but then it took the IRS about 2 months, and this is the fastest they've ever worked to actually send this money out, right? They have to figure out how much each family gets, and then whether the family has direct deposit or they need to print checks, and then the president called all the checks back because he wanted to put his signature on there so that everybody knows this check comes from him, even though it's not his money, right? So all this junk, and then that means that people took weeks, sometimes months, before they actually got the tax cut that was supposed to help. So all these things, and there can be other types of lags involved in the process, but the point is, during this process, by the time we do something about the recession, it can be months, sometimes even more than a year since the actual recession has happened. Now that means we will have left the economy alone this whole time, and that means short-run aggregate supply curve could have already started shifting to close this gap on its own. So if we hit it as if the gap was still as big as the original gap that we realized, then we can oftentimes miss the target. We can shift too much. So that's the ineffectiveness of policies due to lags, right? And the analogy I gave you in the video is, driving a car with the front windshield blacked out, and you can't see what's coming, and your side view mirrors kind of work occasionally, but your best mirror is the rear view mirror where you can see what's behind you, right? Then your steering wheel has a time lag where when you turn left, it takes a minute or so before the car actually turns, and then your brake and your gas both don't respond as quickly either, right? So that's what it's like to manipulate the economy using policy, right? And it's quite a miracle that we haven't derailed this whole thing and driven the economy completely off the cliff, if you ask me, right? So.
Yeah, because the way it really works is that the driver isn't you. It's some old guy who's still trying to use Siri, but doesn't know how to use it. And just to complete the analogy.
There you go. Yeah, yeah. Maybe there's some kind of dementia going on. Well, I mean, I don't know how Trump is doing, but Joe Biden
I go
definitely.
back and forth.
Yeah.
Oh, Joe Biden doesn't even know which country he's trying to become president of.
I know, right? Because yeah, when I saw ad. Somehow YouTube showed me a Joe Biden ad a few weeks ago.
Oh
At
my
first,
gosh.
I
Did you
really thought
see
it was
that?
a I really thought it was a ad made by the Republicans to make fun of him because he couldn't even talk coherently. And then I realized it wasn't actually an official campaign ad for him, approved by him. It's like, man, this guy can't talk straight. So that made
Yeah,
me, yeah.
if the man can't read a teleprompter, how in the world is he going to read his inauguration speech?
Right. So yeah, I was pretty sad. But anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's talk about something happier, like econ. So any more questions
Yeah,
from Unit
yeah.
7? You guys are good? Okay, all right. Well, everything's recorded, so if you think of something and if you can't reach me quickly, then you can always go back and look at the videos from either my lectures or our class discussions, and you might have to, find where it is, but at least it's all there, right? And I was telling my colleagues that you guys are doing pretty well even though you're learning remote and I'm recording videos, and they said it's because I make more sense at 1.5 speed. So whatever works, right? I don't care if you watch me at 5 times speed. As long as you feel like this is helping, I'm all for it. Okay. All right. Yeah, go ahead, Stuart.
I had a small question.
Yeah.
I guess
Oh,
after.
Connor. Okay, go ahead since you're talking already.
Okay. Well, mine was just the difference between the lump sum tax and the percent change for
Tax rate.
the taxes and how that changes the GDP.
Uh-huh. The difference is just in the formula for the tax multiplier. And for the lump sum tax, it's a negative MPC divided by 1 minus MPC. Okay. For the tax rate, it's the negative MPC divided by 1 minus MPC times 1 minus the tax rate. Okay. But I told you guys that what I want you to focus on is this one with the lump sum, right? So it's good to know the tax rate one, but this is Econ 151, so I'm not gonna make it a little bit too complicated. And as long as you know how to do the lump sum one, that that should be sufficient. Okay. All right, Stuart.
Yeah, I've been looking on iLearn. I don't see the exam. Could you remind me when it's open from?
Oh, it should be open right after this class, maybe? Or was it? I thought it was open before this class. Let me just double check and make sure I got it set up right. Oh, you know what? Yeah, thanks for reminding me. I haven't activated it yet. That's why. Okay, I'll make it available right after this class. I'll make sure it's open. So
Okay.
yeah,
And when does it close?
Wednesday night, 11:59 p.m.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, I think I opened my
Wait, it was
test for my,
Wednesday that it closes, right?
right. It's Wednesday night.
Oh.
Yeah. So, okay, I'm just looking at it just to double check and make sure. Yeah. So some of the graphs look a little bit fuzzy, but it shouldn't affect how you work on this test. So anyway, okay. Any other questions? Yeah, I'll make sure this is available right after class. You can take it. You guys are good? All right, then good luck on your test, and then don't forget before Friday, do the concept check quiz for Unit 8. The lecture video is already posted, so watch that after the test. Then we'll meet next Monday to talk about Unit 8, okay? All right, see you guys in a week.
Thanks a lot, Brother Ma.
You're
Have a good
welcome.
one.
You too, bye.